I'm from Grand Valley State University in West Michigan, where we've had quite a bit of snow this year. So I'm just loving this Pittsburgh weather. We have snow arriving at my house again on Monday. So today I'm going to be talking with you about pediatric power wheelchair standing devices in an exploratory study that we did. I'd like to thank the ISS committee for inviting us here today and acknowledge my co-presenters who are not here, Dr. Bill Miller and Dr. Naomi Aldrich. I also want to thank our families who have given permission to show identifiable pictures and videos of their children. As you can see, coming forward, they really add a lot to what we are able to present. I do disclose that I have conducted 2 studies involving equipment loaned to my university by Paramobile, and we are very grateful for this loan. A little bit of background here. So when we talk about standing power wheelchairs, there are many different types of standing power wheelchairs. And so we've adopted a definition of a pediatric power wheelchair standing device out of a group in Australia who defines it as a device that a power wheelchair that will electronically convert between sitting and standing and can be driven in either sitting or standing. And there's a bunch of them out on the market. Here in the US, I've seen some new ones this week. But when I was preparing this presentation, primarily the power wheelchair standing devices were coming from Levo, Paramobile, and then from Sunrise. Like I said, there's a couple new ones down there. We use the Paramobile. I'm a little dyslexic, so I can never get all these letters and numbers straight. F5 Corpus VS. Amen. All right. Now I can just breeze through the rest of the presentation. Okay. So when we look at research that has been done with power wheelchair standing devices, we don't really have a whole lot of evidence. And the first clinical studies that were done involved boys who had Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And so Townsend did a single subject research design investigating the effects of a power wheelchair standing device on what we might refer to as impairment level things, muscle length, bone mineral density. And they did note some improvements in muscle length, but they did not find any increases in bone mineral density. And interestingly, even though it was supposed to be a design where there was a baseline, an intervention using the device, and then the device was supposed to be withdrawn, they decided that if children didn't want or families did not want the device removed, that they would just do an AB. So the ability to have causation here is very limited. Bailey did a non-randomized step wedge design driven by the availability of equipment delivery. And again, it was 14 children, boys with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and they reported maintenance of musculoskeletal status and mental health benefits over 20 weeks. And when we hear the word maintenance, sometimes we're like, oh, maintenance. But remember, these children have a progressive condition. So I think that this is super that they were able to maintain that. Again, non-randomized, but also driven by the funding sources in the funding delivery procurement aspects, which again causes us to question causation there. There have been 2 recent published, or I think both of them are available in pre-publication status, looking at children who have conditions other than Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So Field looked at children who had either cerebral palsy or spina bifida and reported positive changes in children's satisfaction and their participation. One thing that's interesting here is that only children who had qualified for funding of their power wheelchair could participate in the study. And I think if I'm remembering the statistics correctly, it was a good number of them that also had to find some private funding from different organizations or out of pocket to be able to have the power wheelchair funded and then be qualified to be in the study. And then Jacob Golke and I Jacob is from Denmark. We did a case series. Of course, there's very little that we can say about causation from a case series perspective. So we undertook this exploratory study to look at the influence of power wheelchair standing device use on activity and participation in children with neurodevelopmental conditions other than Duchenne's. We really took this idea of, yes, these body structure and function things are important, but we really wanted to see what the kids could do if given the opportunity. We used a single subject research design at ABA, repeated across participants, total study length of 20 weeks. So 4 weeks for the baseline, 12 weeks for the intervention, and 4 weeks for with the withdrawal. Our target behavior, which was measured twice a week via the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure, was parent identified activity and participation goals. And for a small study, we collected a heck of a lot of data here. So I just want to point out a few things. So we had some pre-study activities that I think were essential to the safety and success of the children. I conducted, I'm a physical therapist, I conducted a focus PT examination. We completed with the family a standing clearance form that the families had to get signed by their physician to have medical clearance for the children to participate. And then I worked very closely with the territorial sales representatives. I'm looking over, making sure I'm using the right terminology, from ProMobile to make sure that we could set up the device to work safely and appropriately for the children. And in this way, we really mirrored, sorry, I'm from New England, we don't say our R's very well. We really emulated the practice environment, because as a licensed physical therapist, I just don't go out and do these things on my own, right? I work with my ATP professionals, and this to me was invaluable. You can see that we did baseline assessments, including the COPM for both parents and children. We did a quality of life measurement called the EQ5DY, both parents and children, and we did qualitative interviews. After the baseline, the power wheelchair standing device came back into the home. We looked at the child's ability to drive both at this initial screening session and at the end of the intervention session. During the intervention, there was a minimum of at least 4 check-ins, could be in person or via Zoom. I think all the children had at least 5. One child lives about 2.5 hours away from me, so I only drove to see her 5 times during that time. Okay. And then we had the withdrawal phase, and at the end of the withdrawal phase, we repeated our assessments. So for data analysis, when you're looking at single subject research design analysis, there's a lot of things that we could do, but we chose to look at our target behavior using a split middle acceleration lines method as proposed by Aldrich. And what this does is it looks at the proportion of intervention data points above and below the baseline A1 intervention and the withdrawal acceleration lines. I'm sorry, the mic is right in the way of my eyes here. And then because it's a single subject research design, we can't really look at statistics for anything other than the target behavior. So we looked at clinical significance for all COPM performance scores, so for the children and the parents, and also for the universal assessment of the learning process involving the children's use of the power wheelchair component and the standing component. And then we used descriptive statistics to assess data collected by the My ProMobile app. I've seen this also called the ProMobile Connect app, and so I think it's kind of used interchangeably throughout. This proved to be a really great aspect to provide some hard data about use for the children. So we ended up recruiting 5 dyads. That was our goal, was to recruit 5 parent-child dyads. And we had one child who, after they got through all the initial pre-activities, withdrew from the study because of some housing issues. Sorry, there's an awful lot of yelling and noise coming from that direction. That's a little distracting to me. My apologies. When we look at our target behaviors, which remember was the parents' perceptions of changes in their children's activities and participation, we had 5 COPM goals for each child. So we have 5 graphs. But I thought I'd just kind of point out on one of the large graphs here, see if I can use my mouse here. So in acceleration line, what you do is you draw a acceleration line, and here's the acceleration line at baseline here. Oh, okay, sorry. Well, this is why I wanted to jump over. So you see that at the beginning there, you had you have the low line there. That's my husband says I can yell really loudly, so I'm just going to come on over. So here, thank you. Here you can see that you have the acceleration line for baseline because it's so low. Here you have the acceleration line for intervention. Here you have the acceleration line for withdrawal. And what you do in the split line acceleration method is you count the number of points that are above the baseline level during intervention and below the intervention level during withdrawal. And there's a table by Ottenbacher that gives you significance, and we chose a 0.05 level of significance. Pretty obvious that all the points are above, right? So that's kind of nice. Pretty obvious that all the points are below, so that's kind of nice. And a lot of them ended up this way. I'm going to leave this here because I'm afraid I'll get it. Don't want to drop your mic. Okay. So all of the acceleration lines look like that. So for each of the target behaviors from parent number 1, and these included activities like doing things and standing at the kitchen counter, being able to participate in family activities, keeping up with peers. They were all statistically significant increases in COPM performance ratings from baseline to the end of intervention at that 0.05 significant level, and then statistically significant decreases from the end of intervention to the end of withdrawal, again at 0.05. So this trend continues for each of the children. Okay, every goal for every child was statistically significant increases from baseline to the end of intervention, and then statistically significant decreases from the end of intervention to the end of withdrawal. A lot of the children, a lot of the families rather, had different types of goals. Like this child, the parents wanted him to be able to get a glass of water because they had one of those refrigerators that has the dispenser for water and ice. Wanted the child to be able to go to the cabinet, get the glass, and fill it up with water. Again, everything was statistically significant when it was supposed to be, and significant for decrease when it was supposed to be. Okay. And for number 5, a lot of their goals were things like playing at the counter because she's a twin. So sister liked to play at the counter and do some things, pretend wash dishes, things like that. And so mom wanted the child to be able to do things like that as well. Again, those statistically significant increases and decreases for all goals. We also achieved clinical significance, so an increase of 2 or more points for all parent-identified activity and participation goals throughout the intervention phase. For the child participants, only 2 of the children were able to participate in the COPM because of their age and communication abilities. But you can again see the clinical significance here between T0, T1. There are no indicators on the COPM for significance of clinical withdrawal. So we can't really say anything about the differences between T1 and T2 other than that they were less. But I love this child's goals. He wanted to go fast. One of his complaints was that when you put the power wheelchair standing device into standing, it goes slower. His mother and I like that feature. But you can see the impact that this child felt like the device had on his abilities. For child 3, he really was excited about giving and receiving hugs. He felt that being in a wheelchair in a seated position was difficult for him to give and receive hugs, and he wanted to look out his kitchen window. We think about these things as really simple aspects of our life, but man, that was a pretty significant thing for him. But again, everything is clinically significant. The 5Q the EQ5DY, it gives you a health profile as well as a global VAS. I got to admit that it wasn't really what we hoped it would be. We're continuing to do some work with it. One of the items is mobility, and they define mobility specifically as walking. And I think that might have been one of the reasons we had difficulty showing any changes here. Low is good on the health profile side, high is better on the global health assessment. But interestingly, child 1 had their best perceived quality of life at the end of the intervention, and quite a change in their VAS, as did child 3. So it's just kind of interesting to see from the children's perspectives. When we look at the assessment of the learning process, you can see that the children all did really well with their driving. They might have started at a very low phase, phase 3 or 4, meaning they were just getting the idea of moving the device, but they really ended up all into that either stage 2 or stage 3 on the assessment of learning power and mobility use, or the for the universal ELP over here. We see that the children had a little bit more challenge in integrating their standing feature. And interestingly, the child 3 here had the highest abilities within their standing abilities, and our child 5 had the lowest. And that becomes important when we look at this, because we can see here that from the children that used it the most, they had the best outcomes on their assessment of the learning process for both integrating the device into their life, as well as integrating the standing and the power wheelchair devices. Child 3 used it 100% of possible days and had over 16 hours of standing in 12 weeks. It's amazing for a child who never really stood by himself before. Okay. Just a quick quote from child 3. That other stander I used was just a normal stander, and it just kept me standing up. It didn't have anything compared to the power wheelchair standing device. If I wanted to stand up at school, I could stand up, and then I could just sit right down if I felt like it. And in the community, if I wanted to stand up anywhere I went, I could just stand up. I went to a Christian music concert, and when everybody said stand up, I stood right up. And after that, I sat straight back down. I've used the power wheelchair standing device at church. I stood up there, and after I stood up there for a while, I went straight back down, just like everybody else. A couple of things to point out in our discussion. We saw a lot of similarities to some of the themes we saw in our qualitative work. Looking at the studies involving children with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, there's possible transdiagnostic application of these devices. And interestingly, none of the candidates in the study had been ever used a power wheelchair, let alone a power wheelchair standing device, and none were considered to be candidates for power wheelchair use. Of course, there's always limitations. We really wanted that 5th child because that strengthens your rigor. We only got 4. Randomization would have helped. Blinding participants and parents is really not feasible when they've got this wheelchair. And I would have liked to have had more input from children, but I'm glad to have the input from the 2 that were able to give it. And as I talked about yesterday, we learned quite a bit for our future study. Okay. So in conclusion, all of the participants showed statistically and clinically significant improvements between baseline and the end of intervention, and then statistically significant decrease in performance on parent identified activity and participation goals in the end of the withdrawal phase. Okay, our references and any questions, and please also feel free to contact me. Thank you. I just a second, I really apologize. That was quite loud, and it's in another language that I kind of speak a tiny bit of. So I was like, sorry, Lenore. That's an excellent question. Our therapy centers are driven off of those funding things. If they don't think the children meet the funding obligations, they don't put in. I don't know if any of you had, attended Jean Minkle's session the other, was it only yesterday morning, on denials. She said that if the family really wants something, even if she doesn't think they'll meet the specifications or the qualifications for funding, she does all the work and submits it, because then it shows that there's interest in the device and maybe things will change.